Without any further ado, let me pick up from where I left off last night. So therefore, we are talking about the spring lectures of 2019 entitled, now let's go back, entitled, A Catastrophe But Not a Holocaust. The Ordeal of Orthodox Jews in the First World War, 1914 to 1918. That's the title of the series. And tonight is the second of these 5 lectures entitled The Coming of the War and the Disaster in the East, 1914-1916. So here we go. Yesterday I did the, beg pardon? What did it say? Typo. Yeah, don't worry about it. I got news for you. The war only lasted as long as it lasted. Anyhow, you weren't born in 1732. In my book it says, anyhow, World War I. Yesterday I tried to set up the background, and today we plunge into the war, a specific part of it. But looking back, especially from the vantage point of 100 years, all the frenzied diplomatic activity of the 20 years before the war, what I call the fin de siècle, and there was a lot of treaties and negotiations back and forth and this and that, resulted in all the European states committing mass suicide. The First World War was really a Polish firing squad, okay? They all shooting each other. Because that's what happened. Look, they all took each other down. I think you know that. When it's all over, who won? The Kaiser, the Tsar, the Austrians, they all left. So they all committed mutual shooting. So it's kind of funny, all the fancy political activity and all the highly educated diplomats and aristocrats and the treaties and the secret treaties and the codicils to the treaties and all this kind of business. And what was the result? Stupid. In this series that I am concentrating, as I told you yesterday, on the Eastern Front, not doing the whole business. And so I'm going to confine most of my remarks today to a relationship between 3 players, because these are the protagonists on the Eastern Front. You have over here, let's go to the next one, these 2 allies, the 2 Kaisers, Franz Josef of Austria and Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany. They're on one side of the front lines, and Tsar Nicholas II, the Russian army's on the other side. Go for 1,000 miles, and that's the Eastern Front. There's the Russian army, on and on and on and on, and here's the German army, and then the Austrian army, one giant long line. It's crazy. So it's 2 against 1, but it's not against Russia. Russia's gigantic. Russia's more than both of them put together. As I said yesterday, the 3 powers, these 3, allowed relations between themselves to deteriorate. It is never a wise policy in politics to allow that to happen. I've made the point here that Israel has gotten into wars with Arabs when political systems or processes deteriorate beyond a certain point. So just to keep things from deteriorating in the war, you got to keep some political stuff happening. Since relationships between Germany and Austria on the one hand and Russia on the other soured, this allowed the French to make a move to hook up with Russia. And that, my friends, is the First World War. It's Germany and Austria versus Russia and France on one side. Russia on one side, France is on the other. This was old-fashioned balance of power politics, very realpolitik logical. You have this thing, so I'm teaming up with another country. Now it's Russia and France against Germany and Austria. But it's very dangerous because when you have literally a balance of power with no preponderance on one side or another, it's a big temptation to go to a war, because each one thinks they can knock the other one out. This is the great folly of balance of power politics, which is why the American founding fathers did like the Monroe Doctrine and things like this to stay out precisely of that. We don't want to get involved in European wars with the balance of power and all the rest of it. You guys do that across the Atlantic. Leave us out. The problem in our specific case started in 1870. Everybody knows this. When Germany, Prussia under Bismarck, defeated France, but then took away the 2 provinces of Alsace-Lorraine, which turned the French into a permanent enemy on the lookout for revenge. And here you have the famous business where France was raped, that is to say, in 1871. This is how far the Prussian army got in the War of 1870, okay? The Prussian army totally beat the pants off the French, and they conquered this much, whereupon France had no choice but to totally surrender and give up this part over here. This was such a humiliation, the French never got over it. And that itself was a great failure of politics on the part of Bismarck. Now, he was a smart guy, he realized it, but his Yetzer Hara prevailed and he wanted Alsace-Lorraine. So he could not allow this to beat this. He couldn't help himself, he's a Prussian. He allowed this to beat this, even though he knew there would be a problem forever. Let me explain very briefly. If you take away something that the other guy can't get over, then you're condemning it to an eternal enmity. The essence of statesmanship is to kind of avoid that. When Napoleon fell from power, in 1814, they knocked out Napoleon. They could have taken away a lot of territory from France. The French had, over the centuries, conquered Alsace-Lorraine, for example, from the Germans and other things. And there were big temptations to do so. Metternich very wisely said like this: don't make France permanently angry. Make them part of our club. You get it? Let them keep their former lands and let them join in the haves and not be in the have-nots. Then they won't be on the out and they won't try to upset the whole apple cart. So that means Austria forwent gaining Lorraine and things like that for a higher purpose, which is the essence of statesmanship. Bismarck was a brilliant guy, but the Yetzer Hara here got better of him, and therefore France was constantly in the look for it to get back. Let's go to the next one. Here's the famous scene where Bismarck tells the French, that's Thiers, the French president, I demand Alsace-Lorraine, and the other guy's like crushed. And Bismarck said, this is the way it is, okay? So you know what that did? It burned on the French psyche. By the early 1900s, an alliance between France and Russia was a reality, even though theoretically it made no sense because France is a republic and Russia was a czarist dictatorship. But politics makes strange bedfellows, as we know. This was then balanced by an alliance between Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So you got two countries, we got two countries. And therefore you end up with what they call the European balance of power. Here's Germany and Austria, a big landmass. Look what I'm doing. That's the whole Central Europe. Germany, Austria. And here's France and Russia. So it's like, really lined up in a kind of a balance. England at that time was neutral. As events were to demonstrate, this particular balance of power that I just showed you in the map favored Germany. The French and the Russian armies were distinctly inferior to the German army, and the reason is very simple. The Germans have a long tradition of these military brainiacs, okay? There's von Moltke, there's Clausewitz. You've heard of Clausewitz, who wrote the famous book on war. They have given their best kochos to analyzing in an abstract way the essence of war, and they did a very good job of it. And therefore, the Germans, as the famous expression went, were always preparing for the next war, while the French were still planning to refight the original war, you see? And the French didn't produce anybody like this. The Russians didn't produce anybody like that. So everybody knows, it's not even a question, that if England had not joined the war, which they didn't necessarily have to do, Germany would have walked all over them, both of them. Okay? Germany would have walked all over France. Germany would have walked all over Russia. Not even a question. So the one thing, if you're the Emperor of Germany, you don't want to do is alienate England, and that's what he did. That shows you how dumb Kaiser Wilhelm was. This was his fatal blunder, because there he is, he's the grandson of Queen Victoria. That's Queen Victoria. That's her grandson, Kaiser Wilhelm. That's Prince Edward, who became Edward VII, King Edward and the Kaiser. So they're all relatives, close relatives too. Do you understand Queen Victoria's daughter was the mother of the Kaiser? Right? They must have 100 movies about this, I'm sure. And wait a minute, but he was so dumb that he allowed this guy to influence it. It's not a rabbi, it's a German admiral. Right? Tirpitz, who said, let's build a navy bigger than England's. Now, first of all, England's not going to like that. Second of all, what exactly does Germany need a navy for? Now, the only answer is to fight England. What else do you need a navy for? Tell me a nice way of alienating a country that it's not necessary to alienate. If Germany had never built a navy, England would have stayed out of World War I. If England would have stayed out of World War I, Germany would have walked over everybody. So look, you see what I'm saying? Look how dumb some moves are. Without England, they would have won. Even with England, by the way, Germany almost won the war. By 1917, they were at the end of the rope, and Woodrow Wilson saved their bacon, correct? That's why they were desperate. They were begging America, begging on their knees, please come into war in 1917 because we cannot hold out. And I think it's a W do today among historians that if America had not entered the war in 1917, one of two things would have certainly happened. The first is there probably would have been a negotiated peace. Winston Churchill has written articles about this because all the sides were fed up. Alternatively, had there not been a peace, Germany would have won. Because I think many of you were aware, the Second Battle of the Marne, the Germans came close. So if the American army wasn't there to back it up and all that, it would have walked all over them. So I'm just telling you the what-ifs are quite remarkable. The point of this briefest of backgrounds is to show that without really thinking things through, Russia found itself committed to fighting a war of unprecedented scale for which it was not really prepared. And that, my friends, is what we call the Eastern Front. A war that Russia had to fight all along its western frontiers. That's long Russian borders. A gigantic area, 1,000 miles long. How do you maintain a continuous battle line 1,000 miles long? Israel couldn't do it. So look at this. There's the sea, and there's the sea. This is the Baltic or something, and here's the Black Sea. So the whole doggone Europe. I mean, how do you do this? Look, one side, the Russian army. The other side, the German, Austrian army. And that, my friends, is what we call World War I. The Russian army had a basic competence. The Russians were good soldiers personally, but they suffered serious structural problems. For example, here's one tiny example of many that showed they didn't have sergeants, that a big what's the right word, lack of non-coms. Interesting, you can't run an army without your sergeants. You don't even think of things like that. Germany had plenty. Why didn't the Russians do that? They were behind the eight ball. You can't have an effective army if you don't have low-level officers. Okay, now let's get to the Jews. The frontier that I just showed you, the battle zone, was Mamish in the old Kingdom of Poland. Let us look at the maps. Here it is. Here's the battle line. This is the main Jewish neighborhood in the world. Here's what it was when it was the old Kingdom of Poland. Here it is in 1914. It's just that Austria took this, and Prussia took that, and Russia took that. It's the same territory. So the Jews didn't move. So the war was literally fought in the backyard or the front yard of 5 million Jews. Okay? That's not a good place to be. So those of you who had grandparents that moved to this country before 1914, go to the cemetery tomorrow and put a flower and say thank you. All right? Now, let's take a look at the two sides. On the one hand, one side, you had the Tsarist Russia. Under Nicholas II, the last Tsar, Nicholas Alexandra, who was romanticized in the movies and all this, Tsarist Russia was a nadir as far as the Jews are concerned. It hit rock bottom. By the time you get to 1914, the Russian regime, vis-a-vis the Jews, rock bottom. Nicholas and Alexandra genuinely hated the Jews. It wasn't a cynical ploy. They really were like that. The regime fostered reactionary groups which carried out criminal violence against its Jewish citizens, which is a shocking breach of norms, at least during that era. Meaning, the cops were behind the breaking of the law. The cops were the ones who organized, directly or indirectly, the pogroms. So what does that mean? You're in bad shape. It's like a Batman movie, you know? Or if the cops are the bad guys, achavei. And this is a demonstration of an unbelievable political bankruptcy, a moral bankruptcy of the ruling class. If you can't provide a basic public safety to your own citizens, then you've destroyed the legitimacy of your regime. And the Tsar didn't realize, didn't see it that way. To the right-wingers, it was fine, but to the rest of Russia, it wasn't. So this is just very interesting. Here you have Nicholas. Here's Purskevich. They had the Black Hundreds. These are the guys who are the extreme right-wing pogromists, leader of parliament, very popular figure, a friend of the Tsar, and his organization goes around different towns and they organize lynchings, right? Like you said in the South. And the government knows about it. So, oh my goodness, this is Tsarist Russia. And they're the ones going into the war. So you're a Jewish soldier, well, who are you fighting for? Get my point? Who are you fighting for? These ideas were sincerely held by most high-ranking Russians. In our case, most significantly by the Russian military leaders. So the famous commander of the army, this tall guy, 6'3", 6'4", is the Grand Duke Nicholas, who was a second cousin of the Tsar. The Tsar is Nicholas II, and this is the Grand Duke Nicholas, Nikolai Nikolaevich. And here's his general, General Yanushkevich. He's the chief of staff. They both really hated Jews. That's just part of who they were. Read their biographies. Okay? To them, they really believe all Jews are enemies of Russia. Those in enemy territory and those in Russian territory. Hear what I said? As far as the army is concerned, the general staff and these guys, the Jews you see around you are some kind of enemy element, even though they've lived here before Russia ever took over this territory. And the Jews never did anything against Russia. Right? It's not like they had a record of having uprising and things like this. I mean, I can understand why the Russian government didn't trust the Poles. The Poles rose in rebellion, I don't blame them, in 1830, in 1863, and so forth. Okay, I get it. I'm asking you a question. The Jews ever rose in revolt against Russia? Nothing. So they just were a bunch of mamzerim. Now, so their own side will view the Jews with extreme suspicion. It's not that you're suspected by the enemy of being spies, you know. Your own side will view Jews with suspicion, and already at the outbreak of the war, the first thing the Tsar did was to place the entire Pale of Settlement under military dictatorship administration. That was the first order issued on the first day of war, which means the army, not the civilians, have ultimate control over this entire area that we showed before, Eastern Europe, Ukraine, Belarus, Lithuania, and so forth. And that means they can shoot anybody without any questions asked. You don't need a trial. That's the bottom line, cutting through all the verbiage. And no questions asked. Oh my goodness. Now, in that case, how is it possible for a Russian to be patriotic in the First World War? There's a famous story I've said many times over, that in Austria, where conditions were very different, when the war began, a whole delegation of big rabbis from Austria and Hungary went to Franz Josef and they said, "We're praying for you to win the war." And he said, "Let's cut the baloney. You know as well as I do that in Russia, in St. Petersburg, at this very moment, there's a delegation of rabbis going to Tsar Nicholas and saying, we are praying that you should win the war." And the chief rabbi Vienna said, "But there's a difference." What's that? I said, "We mean it." Okay? How are you going to be patriotic in Russia? For what? For what? Okay? Now, that's one side. Now let's look to the other side, which is Germany and Austria-Hungary. The German Empire, as it was called in those days, not the Empire of Germany, but the German Empire, which really, really, really meant the United States of Germany. It was a federal, it wasn't a republic, but it was a federal constitutional monarchy. I want to be very clear about this. Germany was a democracy in the First World War. It was a democracy before the First World War, and it was a democracy after the First World War. What do I mean by democracy? There were elections for a parliament and all that business every 4 years or so, and the government, as is not unknown in America, tried to rig it, by giving this group more votes and that votes and so forth, and that's true, but we've had plenty of funny ballots in American history. You didn't get one man, one vote in this country, one white man, one vote until Andrew Jackson, correct? And you didn't get the women vote till Woodrow Wilson or so. And I've heard of Tammany Hall. It's hard for us to imagine because Baltimore every so honest, we can't imagine political shenanigans. But out there they tell me, so Germany was a democracy. Same thing with Austria-Hungary. Now, it's modified. The emperor was commander-in-chief of the army, right? There's certain things that were built into the Constitution and gave him a little more power. But ultimately, he can't do anything with the parliament won't allow him because they have the power of the purse. Bismarck put in a clause that if the parliament won't vote in the money this year, you can use last year's budget. But that's only runs for a year. So you have a year's grace. Do you follow what I'm saying? If the parliament, for whatever reason afterwards, doesn't like it, they won't vote you the money you want. So that's the ultimate power. This was not the case in Russia, of course, but it was the case in Germany and in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. I just want to be very clear about this. So it was a parliament. Where did the Jews fit in? Well, in Germany, so the German Empire was a bunch of states that voluntarily united into one thing called German Empire. Meaning it's not the Empire of Germany. The Kaiser was not the ruler of Germany. He's the ruler of Prussia, and he's the elected ruler of these other states in the Union, Bavaria, Saxony, I don't know what all these other places are called, right? Württemberg and so forth. Just keep that in mind. Now, on the German side, that's here. This is Prussia. That was the biggest state. But look at this. This is all. Here's Bavaria. Here's Württemberg. Up here is Saxony. Here's some other places. I forget all the Rhenish Palatinate and all that. The Grand Duchy of Baden and so forth. So they really were states. Now, there are Jews here. There are 500,000 Jews in the German Empire. 600,000 possibly. 500,000. That's not a lot. Germany had like 70, 80 million people. So really, it's a small number. By this time, the Jews had full civil rights in Germany. I won't say that there was a total absence of anti-Semitism in Germany, but guess what? I would not say there's a total absence of anti-Semitism in the... Right? So just keep that in mind. The German Jews were therefore sincerely patriotic. Why not? They treat me okay. I repay with loyalty to the fatherland. Plenty of German soldiers, when they're drafted, went in the army and fought and all that kind of stuff. It's not a case, believe me, they didn't do like Russia. He says, oh, why am I fighting for this idiot or something? The opposite. They said, I want Germany to win. Germany's much better than Russia. As far as the Eastern Front go, it's not even a question. If you're a German Jew, then you're fighting a war to liberate the Jews from the Russian tyranny, which was not a lie. You get it? From the Russian barbarism, as they said, which was not a lie. The Aguda put out like that, I mean, all the German Jewish newspapers and organs did that. The Germans, as I said before, had anti-Semitism, but much milder. I mean, you can't compare it to Russia. Jews, how did anti-Semitism express itself in Germany? They wouldn't let you be an officer in the army, okay? They wanted, a big, I'm not saying it's not a big deal, to be an officer, especially a reserve officer in that society before the First World War, was a big prestige. In America, it's not a big prestige. But in Germany, my goodness, and you couldn't do it. The only people in the German military that could be officers were MDs, okay? Because, that's a necessity. But other than that, it's low class. But that was what you call discrimination. It wasn't legal. It's just that's what the army did. You follow what I'm saying? It wasn't built in any law at all, nowhere in Germany, that discriminates against Jews. Generally, anti-Semitism was not a problem in the German army in the First World War. It has nothing to do with Hitler whatsoever. There were German officers and soldiers that are anti-Semitic. That's true in America. Do you have any friends that fought in the Second World War? They'll tell you stories here and there, but I wouldn't say the American army was anti-Semitic. Okay? So, same thing with the German army. I know many stories, many Jews went through 4 years, had no problems whatsoever. Zero. Okay? If you mind your business to be normal like everybody else, any person with a common sense will do that. You don't shirk, then they're in their trouble. The other army, Austro-Hungarian army, this was the best towards the Jews. Okay? Jews could be generals. I mean, by the time you get to 1914, to the late reign of Franz Joseph, the army was really not at all anti-Semitic. This was from the emperor down. And the orders were, leave the Jews alone. Now again, you deal with Austrians over here, with Hungarians. Of course people are personally going to have shtick against the Jews. That's a personal business. But it will not express itself organically in any kind of structural way within the army. And as I'll try to show you a little bit later, the Austrian army was actually, relatively speaking, shockingly good to the Jews in the First World War. And there were plenty of Jews, 2.5 million Jews in the Austrian Empire. Germany, 500,000. Austria, 2.5 million. That's a lot, because you're counting Hungary, Galicia, and I don't know what else. You see? And so they had it pretty good. The problem was that the Austro-Hungarian army stunk. They really did for a whole bunch of reasons. And this is why the instigation of the war by the Austrians. Who started the First World War? Franz Joseph. Now, he was 84 at the time, but he still had his marbles. He just made it, he was a nice guy to the Jews, but he wasn't a smart fellow. And he allowed his general, let's go to the next one, here's Konrad von Hotzendorf, to persuade him to declare war, because they shot the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, right? Remember that in Sarajevo? They shot the Archduke Franz Ferdinand. There was no proof who did it, but he said Serbia was probably behind it, which is true. And therefore, are you going to get away with that? We have to show him who's boss. And the only way to do this is to take out Serbia. It's not why you launch a war, okay? Or let's put it this way. It shouldn't be a reason Austria didn't launch a war, because their army was no good. And this started the whole business, the whole tens of millions of people that were killed in the First World War around the world, was because Franz Josef made the ultimate folly of declaring war in Serbia, which triggered like the stock market. Because when he declared war in Serbia, Russia declared war on him. Then Germany declared war on Russia, then France declared war on Germany, and Chag Gadyon. But next thing you know, everybody's at war with each other, and you have the circular firing squad. Okay? So it's unfortunate. That's why I call it the ultimate folly. As events proved, the Austrian army was such a bunch of boobs, they were unable to conquer Serbia. Look how big. Here's Austria-Hungary, here's Serbia. Okay, here's Austria-Hungary, here's Serbia. The Serbians beat the pants off the Austrians? I'm afraid so. And it was a disgrace because the Austrian general was stunk, General Podgoric and all of the, you can read all the bad details. It wasn't well led. The Austrians spent the least amount of money on military. They were a poor country, relatively speaking. They should not have gone to war under any circumstances. But that's easy with hindsight. I'm just telling you what happened. So if Goliath couldn't beat David, how are you going to take on the Russian army? Right? As the Bible tells us in the next thing, right? If you can't race against people, how do you race against the horses? If you try to run against Raglim, against infantry, and you're tired, so if you can't beat Serbia, look, Austria, how do you go beat that? Look at how big the Russian Empire is. In other words, what I'm trying to say is like this. What exactly was the plan when you declared war? Let me hear this again. I just want to get this straight. Remember that movie, The Mouse That Roared? What exactly is the plan? Now, but it happened. That's why history is so unbelievable. The facts are stranger than fiction. Okay, now with the background that I just gave you, let's get into the war, into the fighting. First, the fighting in 1914. Now remember, I'm talking about the Eastern Front. Now they're basically 1,000 miles, but they're two halves. There's this half I'm talking about, right? And there's the blue and the red. There's this half and this half. Here's the Russian army facing the German army, with its like jaws. And here's the Russian army facing the Austro-Hungarian army with this hump, which is Galicia, as you can see, right? This is Prussia, this is Galicia. And here, with the bulge of Poland into the armpit, as they called it, of Prussia, that's your basic strategic situation in the Eastern Front. Okay, let's do this in detail. Let's do the South first, because the South, the Austrian part, most affected the Jews. I'm talking about Galicia and Bukovina, which had 1 million Jews living there. Okay? So here's the Galician front, right? Typical scene in any city in Galicia the day before the war. Okay? The Russians walked all over them. There were a bunch of big battles. Big battles. The Austrians won a few here and there, but they're mostly with the Russian steamroller, as they call it, the Cossacks. The Russians went crazy and berserk. The Austrians couldn't hold them back. And they collapsed in eastern Galicia. So let's go back one, Jake, for a second. Here. Here, as you see, is Galicia. So obviously, this is, to the left is the western part. To the east is to the right is the eastern part. And this is where the Russians totally broke in the second half. This is what you call Lemberg, Lvov, and those areas, if you know anything about it, that territory. And so the Russians smashed the Austrians, and they occupied eastern Galicia right away in September, October, November of 1914. As I said before, there were huge battles, and they reached the natural frontier of the Carpathian Mountains, because Hungary is protected from Galicia by the Carpathian Mountains. So at least the Austrians could hold the high ground there, hoping to God that somehow or other the Russians wouldn't rush in and break through over there. So basically they lost half of Galicia, and they're trying to hold in. They shouldn't come in and take over the rest. In these few battles, the Austrians lost 500,000 killed. The Russians lost 250,000 killed. So these stupid battles nobody's heard of, the Battle of Stanislavos and this and the other. 50,000 killed, 20,000 in a few months. So the scale of the battle was crazy, and the fiercity of the fighting is indicated. And what happens? The terrible Ruski invasion. When the Russian army overruns Galicia, which is full of Jews, especially Hasidim, There's the systematic rape of every woman they get their hands on, and the killing, I won't say the systematic killing of every man, but killing of a heck of a lot of them on the slightest feeling, because that's what the Russians do, all right? That's just what they do. All you have to do is say, you're a spy, and shoot him. You know, the sergeant's not going to bother you. You get it? I like this Jew's shoes. You know, he said something insulting to the Tsar. I shot him. I'll take the shoes. This is what it was. So it was a nightmare. It all happened Tisha B'Av time. Until then, you saw that everything was going great. There had been peace in Galicia for well over 100 years. And all of a sudden, out of nowhere, is the Russians behaving like behemoths, right? That's what the Russians do sometimes. Didn't Stalin's army rape every woman in Germany when they broke in the Second World War into Eastern Germany? I think people know about it. They make movies about this now, okay? So the Nazis, that's one thing, because they did it to them. But here, you're talking about defenseless people. Now, I want to tell you something very, very interesting I noticed years ago. When I looked at the American Jewish newspapers and press from the years 1914, 15, 16, and so forth. And that was, you can already tell that this was being deliberately hidden, fake news, from American Jewry by the brilliantly insidious British propaganda machine, which was already in operation in the United States from week 1 of the First World War. Not many people know about this. The British set up over here very smartly. One of the things they did was they cut the line, by the way, the telegraph line. So Germany couldn't send any reports in the newspapers, and Britain controlled the flow of information, okay? And they set up a blockade, of course, of Europe, which led the Germans to use their U-boats to try to undermine that. And the British, I forget the guy's name, Hamilton or something like that, came over here, and they set up an operation in New York City in which they figured out ways to influence just about every newspaper they get their hands on. And it didn't work in some, it did work with others. It was pretty doggone effective. And they made up a lot of lies about the Germans, which is why when Hitler came along, a lot of people said, we don't believe this propaganda because they did it in the last war and it was lies. In Hitler's case, it was not a lie. The rape of Belgium, for example, you know, the destruction of nurses, they built a whole big business over here, and the Americans believed it, including Woodrow Wilson from top down. And they hid systematically any news that the Russians were doing anything bad to the Jews. So if you read the Baltimore Jewish Comment, for example, which was the Jewish Times at that time, or the American Hebrew, or the Jewish Standard, or all the standard Jewish newspapers and magazines of yesteryear, you see that somebody got to them. And whenever there's a story, it's interesting, whenever there's a story about Russia, they try to put the most positive spin you can. That's pretty hard. And whenever there's a story about Germany, they always put the most negative spin on there. And I just know I was shocked when I first read it, then I figured it out. And the American Jewish elites, you know, the Reform Jews and, you know, the conservative, the Jewish Theological Seminary, they're pro-British. They went along with this. So if you're American and you're just reading, if I can use the term, you're reading the Jewish Times, it's a fake news. You see, Mamish was a fake news. And it was hidden from them because if the American Jews would know what's going on, there would be a push in this country, you know, to go to war against Russia or something like that. Don't sell them anything, okay? Instead, the Russians were the allies of the British. Why is Britain fighting the war? For freedom. That's what the British said. To liberate mankind from the German tyranny, from the Huns. So why exactly are you allied with Russia? Let me get this straight. No, ask the following question. Germany's a democracy. I mean, you're having one of those European wars. I get that. Germany's a democracy. Russia's autocracy. So let me get this straight now. We should help Russia to bring freedom in the world. Oh, after the war, Russia will change. Oh, really? Do you understand what I'm saying? That's the bamboozle that they put over in this country in 1914, 15, 16, and even into 17. But when the war started in 1917, Woodrow Wilson, politically, even though he wanted to get in the war earlier, Woodrow Wilson was not able to declare war in Germany because it would mean that America would be allied with Tsarist Russia, and all these groups, Jews and many others, would say, what are you doing that for? I am sending my husband, my son, to fight in some war and get hurt and killed? To help Russia? And this is a war, as Wilson said, to save democracy? You get what I'm saying? You can pull it over. The minute the Tsar went down the tubes, which is in March of 1917, Wilson says, oh, now Russia's democratic. April 1917, they went into war. So the Russian situation profoundly affected the American situation. But those who knew, and there were those who get the word out, said, you're talking about the systematic rape and the nearly systematic shooting of all the Jews in Galicia and places like that. Well, what was the result? As you can see, here, let's go to the next one. Next one. 1 minute. Yeah, okay. Look at this. In December 1914, the Army Chaplain Arthur Levy, this is a German, said, "My heart contracts when I see and hear what dreadful atrocities have been carried out here in Poland against Jews by the Russians in the course of the war, and are still going on daily." Now this is December 14, the war just barely started. The pogroms of earlier times are nothing against the ruthless and relentless destruction of Jewish houses and Jewish life, which rolls with the Russian army throughout Poland, with it forwards, with it backwards, meaning when the Russian army advances and when it retreats, wherever the Russian army is, that's where they're killing Jews and destroying homes and things like that. Accompanying it like a menacing shadow. In more than 215 places, pogroms have taken up till now. There's no end in sight to this terror, and that's before New Year's of 1915. Okay, 215 pogroms. At least as ruthless was the raid Russians proceed against the civilian population in the areas occupied by them. After the Russian army occupied Bukovina and Galicia, severe attacks heard here against the Jews who had not fled. So if you live in Belz, or Lemberg, or Strie, or Brody, or one of those many, many well-known towns in eastern Galicia, full of Jews, get out of there, or suffer the consequences. Here too was anti-Semitic resentment in connection with the sweeping suspicions of espionage, collaboration with the enemy, mass-scale executions, arbitrary acts of violence, rape, destruction, and looting. So that's why I entitled this series, A Catastrophe but Not a Holocaust, because most people are not aware of the terrible times that Jews in these areas suffered in World War I, because most of the history books that you and I read when we were going to school concentrates on the Western Front. We heard of Sergeant York, but nobody heard of this. You see? And that's a crime, but I get it, that's how these cultural biases are formed. That's why I'm here today. Now, bottom line is, you see that from August to December of 1914, it was a catastrophe for the Jews of Galicia and Bukovina. That's 1 million Jews, which included a huge number of frum Jews. I mean, I bet you, I'm probably not exaggerating when I say it was 90% was from at that time in those areas, particularly Hasidim. Until then, it had been a paradise, as you saw before. Hundreds of thousands flee to the interior, and this became one of the most significant events of the Eastern Front in World War I. Gigantic numbers flood the interior of the Austrian Empire. They're running away. That's what you do. So they fled across the Carpathian Mountains to wherever they could settle down. And the communities they ran to were not ready for them, because who's ready for a giant influx? In Baltimore, Maryland, if I told you tomorrow's coming 20,000 people, the associate would be overwhelmed. They're ready for 200 and possibly for 1,000, I guess, and 2,000, 20,000, and then multiply it across, okay? And about 100,000 go to Vienna. That's a lot of people. They can't. How do you find food for that? How do you find a Jewish thing for that? You know what I'm saying? You're looking for a civilizational disaster on the moral level and on many levels. It was a terrible time to live through. And these were the lucky ones. Belz, for example, which is in eastern Galicia, was hit very hard. And so the Belz are, let's go back to that. This is how a contemporary writes of the Russian incursion in Debitsa. 8 a.m, the Cossacks arrived in Debitsa. The Jews already survived the initial agonies of looting. By the good troops were gathered in the shoals with their wives and children. The Cossacks plunged in Jewish houses with their horses and weapons, and what wasn't screwed down was smashed and flung in the street. Like wild beasts, they threw themselves at defenseless women and raped them. Those who defended themselves were stabbed and trampled to death. Spirited women plunged through windows, badly injuring themselves, but these were not left alone by the monsters. Many died in the synagogue square from bloody beating of Nagaika, that's like a whip, in agonies of pain. And the Russians like that. The Cossacks are sick dogs, The synagogue street was then set alight, and after a short while, a whole row of houses stood ablaze. And these intensified later in 1915. Besides this increase in pogroms, it meant the Jewish population was driven to the front, Hun-like, and forced against the Austrian position, meaning they used them as, to go against the machine guns or walk through the minefields. Okay? Because why not? There's plenty of Jews around. You see? And again, I'll tell you again, people don't know this. Now, in the case of the Belzer Rebbe, as I said before, here's an example. Yeah, why would anybody want to fight for him? Let's go to the next one. The Belzer Rebbe, I'm just giving one example of some famous Hasidic Rebbe because it becomes a phenomenon. All the Galaxianer big rabbis flee to the interior of Austria, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and that's where they spend the war years. And so the Belzer Rebbe used to be, he had a giant empire in eastern Galicia, wrong place to be. Let's go to the next one. He runs away to Munkac, which is in the Subcarpathian, closer within Hungary. But here, he goes to Munkac. Well, there's already a Rebbe there. They have a turf war. We're coming in here. You want to stay for a while and then move on is one thing. You want to settle down and go into business for yourself, it's a war. Esqualid. It's the First World War. Nobody's acting normal because the circumstances are crazy. You understand? And so what, in this case, happens to the Belzer Rebbe? He moves on, as we'll see in a minute. Vienna, other parts of Austria, Hungary, Bechlal, are flooded with hundreds of thousands of Galaxianer refugees during the entire war. Vienna now becomes something it never was in history. I'm going on a trip there. We have a tour scheduled for in 2 weeks, God willing. And in the years from 1914 till Hitler, Vienna became a major center of Hasidism, of Superfrumism, and all that stuff, which it never was. Because all these Galician Jews went there. That was, what shall I say, food for Hitler, wasn't it? Do you get my point? These Jews are all over the place, they're eating everything, they're all over there, they're lying on the streets. It wasn't their fault. They're dirty. You never heard this before 1914. Well, you did, but nowhere near what you did after 1914. And so, here's a Chartkov Rebbe who settles down in Vienna. This is Rameir Arik, if you know this. There's Yosef Engel. These are famous names in the learned world. They're Galaxianers. They had big rabbis and communities, things like this, in glorious days before the First World War, flourishing. Now they're in Vienna because you can't stay in Galicia. You understand? And the Austrian government, I told you, was liberal towards the Jews, and they did not say you can't move in here. They took a humanitarian attitude, and they said, listen, you're citizens of this empire, and you're running away because of the enemy invasion, and so on and so on, and such and such. You can't fault them on that, okay? The Belzer Rebbe ends up moving to Prague, which is in Bohemia, farther west in the empire. And here you have a Kafka-esque tale, that's Kafka. Because Franz Kafka, again, I hope to do this when we're in Prague. Franz Kafka, Jewish novelist, Prague, Jew, totally assimilated family, super assimilated family, like all the Jews in 1914 were in Prague, with maybe 10 exceptions. And he resents the fact that he has zero Jewish knowledge. And he has a friend, a schoolboy friend, George Langer, who used to be a fun guy and then got serious. Right? Well, he's as we would say today, an upper middle class businessman's son. But let's put it this way, like everybody else in Prague, their Zadie was real frum back in some little town in Bohemia before they moved to Prague and made money, and bourgeois themselves. And this guy, for some reason, unlike the other siblings, looks back to the grandfather era, and something takes him like a magnet in 1913 from Prague to another part of the world 1,000 miles away called Belz. It's not that far away, but culturally it is. It's all in the Austrian Empire, but look how variegated the Austrian Empire is. Bohemia and Prague are totally Western cities like Paris and London. Galicia, even though it's in the same empire, it's like, as they used to call in German, halb Asian, half Asia, It's like Mongolia to them. The way they dress, the way they talk. And he sees past that, and he falls in love with Hasidism, and he wants to convert, and meets the Belzer Rebbe. And the best part of the story, I think, as Mrs. Roosevelt knows, is the Belzer Rebbe assigns a chassid to sort of give him some training in the lore, and it's a young guy named Rabbi Hertzberg. Okay? It's a Kafkaesque story. because eventually he moves. He goes away in 1913, comes back to Prague dressed Hasidic. His parents want to commit him to a mental asylum because by the bourgeois standards over there, normal people don't dress like that. And he goes back in 1914. It's a Kansa Maisa. And he's there when all of a sudden the war breaks out and he runs back. The Belzer Rebbe gives him a bracha that he shouldn't be drafted in the Austrian army because most people get killed. When he comes back to Prague, he's taken to the draft board. He says, I'm a Hasidic Jew. They say, you're mentally insane, you're out of the army. You understand? And because by the standards, if he would live over there, he'd be no. By the standards of Prague. And his friend, Franz Kafka, I said, what was it like over there? Tell me about this, And Kafka, he, what's the right word, encourages. Within Kafka, his Jewish side, his Jewish interest. There's a Yiddish theater that happens to visit Prague at the time that Kafka gets interested in. I could do a whole talk just on Kafka and his Jewish, his very interesting relationship to his Judaism, Jewish side, that wasn't, but he yearned for. And eventually, son of a gun, who pops up in Prague? The Belzer Rebbe. I mean, what were the chances that somebody over there, the World War I, okay? And, Kafka goes and Dambas with him in a minion, because this guy Langer says, come on with me. And then afterwards, they accompany him to the Carlsbad, to the spa, and it's a whole little chapter in the Kafka life, okay? Because Belzer Rebbe, if it's 1915, 1916, you will find them in places you wouldn't have found them in another time. You find about 1 million or so, roughly speaking, Galcian or Hasidic Jews in places you wouldn't find them in another time. But it's called the Russian invasion. And now you can understand why it is, and I'll get this in a while, while the Hasidim will rally to the flag and fight like crazy for Franz Josef, because the war's right up at their front lawn. It wasn't something from far away. If you're fighting in Galicia in the Austro-Hungarian army, what are you fighting for? To re-liberate Belz or Lemberg or Strie or any of the or Brody or any of these towns. You get it? To recover your grandparents' graves. And so it's upfront and personal if you're Hasidic, which is why the World War I is the only war that I know of where the Hasidim fought, period, and second of all, fought bravely under a foreign flag. It's interesting, under a foreign flag. So you end up with World War I having these strange outcomes. Here's another strange outcome. I told you before, many of the Galician refugees run away to Vienna. One of them is a lady with her mother who ends up in some small apartment in Vienna like all the other refugees. And near her is a Gekische Shul, as you and I would call it. It's really an Oberlander synagogue. And the rabbi there is a Samson Raphael Hirsch type, Rabbi Flesh, a small shul, and he's a good speaker. And she likes to come listen to his sermons. And he's always speaking about the valor of the Jewish woman, which is not something you hear in shuls 100 years ago. But he's a Hirschian. If you're a Hirschian, you do talk like that. Because Samson Raphael Hirsch is very much into the dignity and the high position of the Jewish woman. And she's entranced by this. And by the time it's over, she's going to make Beis Yaakov. That's the Arshnir. Because she was a Galician refugee running away from the Russian invasion. And she spent 2 years going to this guy's speeches and so forth. And he had no idea. 20 years later, she writes him and says, "You were an inspiration." She said, "I didn't even do it." And it's all resulted in a crazy Meshuggah situation of the First World War that I'm describing. And so what did she do? She starts out in Krakow, she ends up in Vienna, and then she has this idea to start a Beis Yaakov, the germ of the idea, shall we say. And the Belzer Rebbe is not far away. He's in Marienbad in the Spa, which is not that far from Vienna. So she travels over there like a good Belzer Chassid, and she asks an oracular question. She says, I'm thinking of doing something significant to help Jewish women or something like that, or to help them be from. And he says, Mazel Bracha. And she says, oh, okay. That means I can start the Beis Yaakov. Later on, the Belzer say, he never said that. He just said, this kind of business. But it's the First World War. It's the First World War. So that's why, after the First World War, Belzer Hasidim, among others, will not accept Beis Yaakov. It's not what you think. It took a long time for something even as right-wing as that to get accepted within the extreme right-wing of Polish Hasidism. And to this day, it's not accepted in the extreme right wing of Hungarian Hasidism. Maybe you know what I'm talking about. You don't. The Satmar don't believe in Beis Yaakov, for example. So I'm just telling you, everything depends on where you occupy on the spectrum. But as I said before, let's go to the next one. That's, by the way, that's Sarah Schneer. That's the rabbi, the Hershey rabbi in Rabbi Flesch in Vienna. That's the Belzer Rebbe. Let's go to the next one. There are all these cartoons, Hasidic soldiers, the King's Own Schneiders, in the Austrian army. But look at this. If you're in the Austrian army, on Christmas, every soldier gets, I forget, something like a crucifix or something for a Christmas packet. And every Jewish soldier gets a talis. Even, you get what I'm saying? No, I respect this religion, I respect that religion. Okay? And eventually they get matzahs, and sometimes that's rogim, and once in a while tefillin. It's crazy. If you had 100 Jews in your unit, you were entitled to ask for kosher food. Get it? The experience of the Jewish soldiers in the Austro-Hungarian army, aside from the terrible battle side with the Austro-Hungarian stunk, but putting the battle aside, right, for a minute, in the rear was absolutely remarkable. You had huge units with lots of Jews. Remember, this is a multinational empire. So who do you see in the army? Your Hungarians, your Croats, your Czechs, your Slovaks, your Romanians, your Ruthenians, your Italians. What am I leaving out? Your Serbians, I don't know, whatever, the kitchen sink, and because it's the Austro-Hungarian army. And to tell you the truth, the Jew always has a leg up. Why? He can understand German. Why can the Jew understand German? Yiddish. You say like this, Yiddish is not German. That's true. But by the standards of the Austro-Hungarian army, it is. Because you have a basic idea what the guy's saying. Right? One of the problems of the Austro-Hungarian army was they had 20 languages, and most of the soldiers were peasants. And how do you handle that? They had to learn what they call the 20 words of command. Sit, stop, march, shoot. But if the guy says, I guess, was it shoot or don't shoot? I can't remember. It's not a good idea in the battle. And these are farm boys, so you can have a situation like that. It's a crazy story, but wait a minute. These are a bunch of Hungarians. These are a bunch of Croats. These are a bunch of Jews. It's not like the German army, where it's mostly non-Jews, with a few Jews here and there in the service, like it was in the American army. In Austria-Hungary, you have whole, regiments, the majority is Jewish, or a very significant minority and all the rest of it. And therefore, they don't buddy up with those, but they hang together. And when they make a Seder, it's a Seder. Okay? And when they make a Hanukkah, it's a Hanukkah. I mean, behind the lines. And that kind of thing. And there are many interesting memoirs of Jews, especially people who are not so religious, that says, I encountered a Judaism in the front lines in my service in the Austro-Hungarian army I never saw before, because they had a bunch of Hasidim over here, and they all gathered together for Sukkot, or for Pesach, or something like this, and wow, I never even knew this existed before. You see? And it goes both ways. The Hasidic Jews had to get used to the idea. There are other non-Hasidic Jews out there also. And, the Austrian government sent them these little sitters like this that the Americans had in World War II. Do you ever see those? U.S. Army, many people have seen the Jewish, what is it? Welfare? There was one, the Jewish War Organization, whatever it was. But it was the U.S. government put out sitters for the American soldiers in World War II, but they're abbreviated, And boy, not if you're a Hungarian Chassid in the army. He was like this. Send us a real sitter. You get it? This is. I'm not doing justice to this topic. There are books on it, but time precludes. But it's an absolutely fascinating story. Okay. Like I said, look, everybody gets a talis. If it's a sukkahs, if it's possible, everybody gets esrog. They say like this: the esrogim looked horrible, but they were kosher. That's what somebody wrote. You understand? And being Jews, you always end up with the wonderful story that Jonathan Marr reminded me of the other day, where they send somebody a pair of tefillin, and he writes back, he says, "Can't you send me a Hasidic pair of tefillin?" You understand? I would like to think that got kicked up the line to Franz Josef. You know what I mean? Can you send me a Galtzion or so forth? But anyhow, it's a sign that we want you. Now, meanwhile, by the end of 1914, the Austro-Hungarians were on the ropes, as I just pointed out, barely hanging on. The Russians would have walked all over him and the war would have been over. It would have been a disaster for the Jews, but the war would have been over. Having conquered eastern Galicia and Bukovina, half of Galicia, The Russians now swung around and tried to knock out Western Galicia, but there was a giant fortress named Przemysl that the Austrians had built up as a huge fort, and that blocked them for about 6 months. Okay? So here you go. Look at the fighting. Sieges of the great fortress of Przemysl, which blocked the Russian advance into Western Galicia. Here's the Austrians, hand-to-hand fighting. Okay? I mean, over and over and over again. The Russians tried again. Eventually, they cracked it. In March, I think, of 15, the Russians took Przemysl, which was a great defeat for the Austrians. But it held them up for, I would say, 3, 4 months, 5 months, something like that. Now what? If they broke into Przemysl, then Austria is toast. Okay? So how come they didn't go down? Well, this brings us up to the spring of 1915, which, as you see, was a terrible time for the Jews in Galicia and places like that. It was a terrible time for Franz Josef. Agreed? Hold that thought, because now the story gets interesting. Hold that thought, and let us switch to the northern half of the front, where it was the Russians not against the Austrians, but against the Germans, during the same time, late 14, early 15. Hold that thought. This is the war between Russia and Germany with the strange geography. Here, as I say before, is Germany, and here is the armpit, This is all part of Russia. So if you're Russian, you want to break in here and capture Berlin. If you're German, you want to snap here, right? You want to cut these guys off. Do you get what I'm saying? Like that. Okay? That's the natural strategic plan. Now, what happened over here? The Russians, believe it or not, mobilized before the Germans could. That shocked everybody. They cheated. They started a few days before they declared war. And they flooded East Prussia. They charged into here, into the area of Germany, Prussia, with a gigantic army doing the same things that I was describing before. But here they ran into an entirely different army. They didn't run into the Austro-Hungarian army. They ran into the German army. There was an initial crisis, because the Germans sent all their men to knock out France. It's called the Battle of Le Marne, the Schlieffen Plan, which didn't work. But at least it makes sense strategically. Had it worked, they would have wiped out France and then gone back and wiped out Russia. So the Russians moved in exactly when the border was relatively defenseless. And this was the great crisis of the fall of 1914, which is so well known. After an initial crisis, the team of Hindenburg and Ludendorff took over, and they beat the pants off the Russians in the Battle of Tannenberg and the Masurian Lakes, and became the heroes of Germany. Hindenburg was an old man. I think he fought in the 1866 war. Seriously. So, I don't know, was it 70s or something like that? He was the general. The way it works in the German army, there's a general and a chief of staff. His job is to think and do. His job is to preside. That is how it works in the German army, right? I have a chief of staff to do all the work. Ludendorff, Erich von Ludendorff, was a military genius. He was not a nice man, but he was a very smart and capable. Let's put it this way. He was not a military genius, but he was a very smart and capable staff officer. Very, very, very capable. And so these guys figured out what the Russians were up to, and without going through all the details, they wiped out the Russian army. They cut them off and destroyed them. So this was a savior of Germany from the kind of Russian rape flood that I was describing before. And naturally, Hindenburg became the god of Germany from then on. And all during World War I, you have pictures of Hindenburg everywhere. They sold little statues and things like this. You can understand it. Now, the truth is, the military historians will tell you, these guys weren't the brains. This guy, he was the chief of staff of the chief of staff. You know what I'm saying? General Max Hoffman, who's less well known, and he was the real brains of the operation. He couldn't rise to too high position because his wife was Jewish. What do I mean? Wait a minute. This is the German army. His wife was Jewish means they converted in 1800 to Christianity. But the German got a long memory. You see? So it's like that. But nevertheless, he was a very smart cookie, and he really ran the operation. My favorite story is, after the battle was over, it was Hindenburg, so he took some of the German officers from professional point of view to show them the battlefield. And he said, this is where this happened. He said, this is where Hindenburg slept before the battle. And then he took him over there. He says, this is where Hindenburg slept after the battle. He said, follow me. This is where Hindenburg slept during the battle. You understand? That was true. But who cares? It means that the Germans, as I said before, outnumbered, smashed the Russians, okay? And from then on, the German army started winning heavy losses, but from then on, till the end of the war, the German army went on a winning streak. So the Eastern Front in World War I was different than the Eastern Front in World War II, okay? Because Hitler made stupid mistakes, as I think many know, with Stalingrad and all these other things in World War II. That's because he thought he's smarter than the generals. Well, guess what? The generals were highly trained, the most highly trained soldiers in the world. They actually know what they're doing better than you, Hitler. But you're not allowed to say to Nazi Germans that they paid the price. The Kaiser was a figurehead. He said, I leave it to the generals, you do it. And they did it in a very professional way. So they went up to here and stopped. And then when they're ready, they went up here and stopped, and so on and so forth. The great mistake of Germany, looking back in retrospect, was not concentrating the Eastern Front, which was always under-supported. If you know what I just described, had they made their main move in the East instead of in the West. Look, you can't win in the West. It's all quiet in the Western Front. The British and the French have one long line of trenches and machine guns and junk like that. The Germans have the same thing, and A charges B, B charges A, they just wipe each other out. Isn't that what happened? Verdun, the Somme, Passchendaele, all the Ypres, the 5th Battle of Ypres, the 6th Battle of Ypres, they just wiped each other out because it was a stalemate. So then don't do it there. Hold the minimum, send all the guys and knock them out here, which they could have done. But the Germans didn't see it that way. The commander-in-chief was Falkenhayn, right? And he had this idea he's going to smash the French at Verdun. It was his obsession, and that's why Germany lost the war. They could have very easily won the First World War. That's why they lost the war. If they would concentrate on the Russian front instead of keeping it under strength all the time, then they definitely would have won. But anyway, it's funny, by the way, Germany had such a faulty grand strategy. With enough men and supplies, they could have beaten Russia by 1916. As it happened, the Austrians by now were in desperate straits, as I told you, and the Germans, instead of rolling on, had to rescue the Austrians. And so the result is, they said, if we want to save Austria, we have to have a big offensive in Galicia to smash the Russians. So they said the Austrian army is no good unless they're fortified with Germans. So they moved the German army down there, and they took over. You know, the Austrians are officially in command, but the Germans give the orders. And they said, you're going to do it our way, and we'll win. And that's what happened. And so there was a gigantic offensive called the Tarnów-Görlitz offensive in the spring and summer of 1915. And the Germans handed the Russians a mighty defeat and saved Austria and liberated Galicia. So in 1915, starting in May, June, July, August, September, October, November, December, they were on a constant roll. These were the famous German commanders of yesteryear, the other dream team, General von Mackensen, and his chief of his brains, von Seeckt. I know these names don't necessarily mean anything to you. It would be weird to me if they did, but they are very well-known people in history. I mean, these are not unknown names. And they were the German soldiers at the top of the game. That's my point. Germany had a lot of these guys because they put so much time and training, didn't they, into intellectual thinking about war, that they just had these good guys. And I'm not going to give the details about it, but they saved the Austrian Empire. And for the Jewish point of view, they conquered Poland, Galicia, and Lithuania in 1915. Okay? That's remarkable. They finally did what I told you. They went this way. Except they didn't do it fast enough, so the Russians pulled out. You see? But they took over the whole territory of classic Poland, and then they had to stop because the supplies ran out. In the old days, you were stuck on the supplies. So the front stabilized in Belarus. So I'll say it again. Poland and Lithuania and Galicia were all taken over by the Germans and the Austrians, and the Russians held beyond there. And that's the way it was for the next 2 years. Suddenly, all the Jews of Poland and Lithuania and Galicia found themselves under the rule of Germany and Austria. Now, if you're in Galicia, you were under the rule of Austria anyway before. But if you're in Poland, I'm talking about Warsaw, Lodz, Lublin, places like that, Polish Yidden, as we call them, this was brand new. They've been ruled by the Tsar of Russia for 100 years. And all of a sudden, the Russians are gone, and the German army marched in. You can see pictures of it, one after another. The Germans are marching to Warsaw, Germans are marching to Vilna, Germans are marching to Kovna, and so on and so forth, over and over again during 1914. So look what I'm doing. The Germans conquered this, like I'm doing now. That. It's a big area. Now the Russians had the rest, okay? And that's how this would remain the reality for the rest of the war, which means 5 million Jews, for the first time, will find themselves, to put it bluntly, under control of the German army. So the question we're going to be dealing with, maybe tomorrow mostly, is what did the German army do with this 5 million Jews? Because they owned them lock, stock, and barrel, 1915, 16, 17, and 18. That's how it went. It's very interesting. Now, let's turn to something we haven't discussed yet. What did the Russian army do in Russia, especially when they're pulling out? I'm talking about how did the Russian army act to the Jews in Russia. I already told you how they acted towards the Jews in Galicia. How they act to the Jews in Russia. From the beginning of the war, the Russians suspect all the Russian Jews of disloyalty. If you're a Russian general, one way of solving the problem of the Jewish population of proportions in the territory under your command, it's not Hitler, so you can't kill them, so what do? You expel them. And you don't have to worry about them. They're not in your province anymore. The U.S. did this, am I right? You ever heard of this guy? What did General Grant say when he said, too many Jews in my theater of command? They're all kicked out. General Order number 26, right? They're all kicked out of the Department of the Tennessee. All Jews out of Mississippi, all Jews out of Kentucky, all Jews out of this. Right? Because he said, I just don't want to deal with this. Let them go somewhere else. So the Russians did it on a mass scale. Now, in the case of Grant, you're talking about 1,000 Jews or so, maybe 2,000. In the case of Russia, 2 million. That's right, the Russians forced out of their homes as part of the general retreat. In 1915, 2 million Jews. Okay? It's an unbelievable upheaval. Now, it's different. Abraham Lincoln canceled that order of Grant as soon as he found out about it. It's a famous story in American history. As soon as the Jews said Grant kicked out the Jews as Jews, Lincoln said, I guess, you'll hereby cancel that order. First of all, Grant canceled the order, and then he said, I guess, I didn't really sign it, one of my secretaries signed it, and all that kind of stuff. If you're in Russia, well, you don't cancel no order. Why should you cancel an order? The Tsar agrees with that too. And so here you are, with an hour's notice, maybe half hour's notice, pick up your bags, whatever you want to take out of your house, and start walking. What do you take out of the house? And for all you know, they'll burn the house down or something like that. So here you are, you had a nice life, relatively speaking, until now. Let's say you're a middle-class person. What do you take? Because you know as well as I do, the Russians go steal everything that's not nailed down to the stove. So what are you going to take? What are you going to eat when you get to the first place tonight? And what do you do tomorrow? And what happens when your shoes run out? And this, at least, was the summer. Imagine when it gets to the winter. That's why I call it a catastrophe, although it's not a Holocaust. But it was a catastrophe, okay? Many Jews flee the frontline area on their own, including some yeshivas. The first day the war started, the Slobodka yeshiva immediately foresaw what's happening, and so we're getting out of Kovno, which is near the front. We're moving to Minsk, right? The Alter Slobodka Moshe Morechevsi. We're moving from Kaunas to Minsk. Is that it? Can I see right? Is that Minsk? Yeah. Okay. It's 165 miles away. Simply to get out of the war zone. It's a good thing they did it because a little bit later the Russians just forced everybody out. So they at least left, in a civilized way, on a train. And you start to see huge upheavals over here. So the Slobodka yeshiva during World War I is not in Slobodka. So when Rabbi Ruderman, right? When Rabbi Ruderman enters the Slobodka yeshiva, when he was a young boy, relatively speaking, it wasn't in Slobodka. Slobodka is in Kovno. It's a suburb of Kovno. It's in Belarus, 180 miles away, 165 miles away. And in the other yeshivas, where they didn't plan like this, the boys vote with their feet. They just run away. Some come back. It's a chaos. It's a chaos. It's a war. You're worried about your own army more than the enemy army. And what do? And people are starving, and you know what happens when people starve. It brings out the worst in them. Traditional Jewish life is obviously an extreme crisis from the war conditions. How are you going to have a shul? How are you going to have a yeshiva? How are you going to have a school? How are you going to have a bar mitzvah? Something like that. And that's only in 1914. In 1915, things got worse for the Russians and the Russian Jews. When the Russian army began to succumb to the onslaughts of Mackensen and Hindenburg, the Russian general blamed it on the Jews, which of course makes no military sense, but as we know from Farrakhan, it doesn't have to make sense to get traction. It doesn't have to make sense to get traction anyway. And the result is that the Grand Duke, Nicholas, and General Yanuskevich issue all these orders. Since the Jews caused defeat, I'm expelling them from Lithuania, from Latvia, from this place and that place, and all the rest. And men, women, and children, it's your fault. Even though that was a big lie, of course. And so the Russian army could not defeat the Germans, but they could defeat the Jews. As the Russian army retreated steadily during the summer and fall of 1915, it's called the Great Retreat, they were in a bad mood, naturally. They're constantly retreating. The Germans are busting them all the time. The Russians, as they retreat, see Jews all over the place in towns and villages along the way, because it's in Poland, isn't it? It's in Belarus. It's in the Jewish Pale settlement. And the Russians realized the Jews might not be unhappy to see the Germans and the Austrians, that the Jews might have a kesher with the Germans and the Austrians, either for Yiddish or maybe because they look at liberators. And therefore, they might share information with the invaders. And that went against the Russian policy to scorch the earth. And scorching the earth means burning everything and destroying everything so the enemy have nothing left behind. And scorching the earth, in the case of the Jews, you can't burn their farms. The Jews don't have any farms. It means scorching the Jews, meaning not burning them, but forcing them to walk the hundreds of miles to the rear, and whoever drops, drops. Scorched earth is a traditional Russian policy because they have a lot of land. It worked with Hitler. It worked with Napoleon. I mean, I get the word, but if you're Jewish, and you had nothing to do with the fortune of the battle I just described, correct? The Jews didn't cause them to lose the Battle of Tannenberg. The Jews didn't cause them to lose to Mackensen. Yes, they did. Now, I was surprised. I looked on the internet. There's a series on the First World War, and the guy got it right. It, shocked me. It's about a minute or two of a series, and I want you to hear it, and listen to what the guy says. He does have his facts straight, which really amazed me.
Russia had been in retreat from the German and Austro-Hungarian armies for nearly 3 months, losing huge areas of land and hundreds of thousands of prisoners. But what could she do to prevent the invaders from making use of their gains? Well, Russia adopted a scorched earth policy. The German phalanx under General August von Mackensen moved inexorably onward. There was heavy fighting this week between the Bug and Vistula rivers, but the Russians still stubbornly defended the Lublin-Chelm railway line, even as they retreated along their entire line. Things were really looking grim over in the Polish salient, where the Germans attacked both north and south of Warsaw on the 19th. The Germans also stormed the fortresses of Rochan and Pultusk and crossed the Narew River. But as the Germans advanced in Poland, a lot of people weren't sticking around to see how things would turn out. The Russian High Command received reports of large-scale, systematic depopulation of the Plock district northwest of Warsaw, where Russian units had uprooted 22,000 of 25,000 inhabitants and torched their villages in a scorched earth policy. Actually, all Russian-controlled areas subject to the threat of invasion came under military administration. And the principal thought concerning Nikolai Yanushkevich, chief of the general staff, was to scorch the earth and leave the invaders nothing but wilderness. Thing is, the effect of this was really terrible for industry in any cities under threat, as Warsaw was now, for example. But think of the effect on the civilian population. Peter Gatrell's book about Russian refugees during the war has this first-person experience. We were forced to burn our homes and crops. We weren't allowed to take our cattle with us. We weren't even allowed to return to our homes to get some money. By the end of 1915, yeah, I know it's jumping ahead. By the end of 1915, there would be 3.3 million refugees in Russia. You had families that ran successful farms who were totally impoverished. Industrial cities would lose their entire workforce. In Warsaw, the whole population was eventually told to leave because it was worried that the Poles really supported Austria-Hungary. Refugees also carried disease like typhus or cholera, and since they now had nothing, they would often have to resort to looting just to survive. So the army, on its great retreat, while admittedly leaving little of use for the Germans or Austrians, was making things a lot more difficult for itself, particularly clogging what was already a totally inadequate system of transportation. To make things even worse, Yanushkevich was so anti-Semitic that it pissed off the Russian public opinion. And considering the thousands of Jews killed in Russia during the pogroms of the last couple of decades, that's pretty serious. So certain areas were cleansed of supposedly unreliable elements, like those of German ancestry or Jews. Having said that, there was a positive side for Russian Jews as well. Until mid-1915, they had been mostly limited to living in cities and towns in the Pale of Settlement since the time of Catherine the Great, 120 years earlier. But the Pale would soon be abolished as the Great Exodus continued, and Jews would be allowed to relocate further east and also to settle in the countryside instead of only the towns.
That's correct. I want to. I'll talk about that, I think, on Thursday night more with the Pale settlement. I just want to rush through a few more points. It's always late. I just want to show you 1915 had two great developments. First of all, the Germans conquered Poland and Lithuania, but prior to that, you had all this suffering on a giant scale. A catastrophe, though not a Holocaust. Okay, suffered and repeated Russians who shot and forced marched hundreds of thousands at a moment's notice. In the midst of this bedlam, to avoid random destruction, the yeshivas, for example, relocate from Lithuania to Belarus. So a place like Minsk and Gomel and all those places, it's a country over, but in Russia it's 100, 200 miles away, where the Germans have not yet penetrated and will not penetrate for another 2 years. And that's why the yeshiva, so here's Poland and Lithuania, and here's Belarus, so the yeshivas all move from here to here, or from here, if you wish, to here. And later, when the Germans will conquer this, they'll move here. And that's the story of most of the Lithuanian yeshivas in the First World War. When the Germans will resume and conquer Belarus, they'll relocate to the Ukraine. So, as you see, there will be two yeshivas that will stay behind, Telz and Kelm. I'll talk about that later. So the Russians are the bad guys, the Germans are the good guys, but this was hidden from the West. I told you before. You read the Jewish Times, you wouldn't know a thing that I just told you. You wouldn't know a thing. Isn't that terrible? Okay? Instead, you had, that's why all these big rabbis were in Minsk in these years. Okay? My father lived there at that time. I was born in 1950. That's Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Novus, the rabbi. That's Rabbi Baruch Ber. That's Rabbi Chaim Brisker. Famous name with Russian soldiers, Jewish soldiers, of course. Minsk is a hotbed of activity during these years. Let's move to the next one. Yeah, this is what they show about the Germans, how bad they are. They don't show about the Russians. Get it? It's all the anti-German propaganda. The pro-German stories were suppressed by the fake news artists, and the masses are asses they don't know. I'll show you a real story. Go to the next one. These are Russian people. Listen to what I'm telling you. These are Jews. They're Russian army. They're prisoners of war. So they're Jews in the Russian army captured by the Germans, but they let them go for Shabbos if they sign a patrol not to run away, and they can attend shul in Berlin. And these are all German Yankees. All Germans surround them want to see Russian Jewish prisoners. You get it? It's not Hitler. But you won't find this in the Jewish Times or in the New York Times or anybody else. The Germans are the bayonet-staying babies. You get what I'm saying? If you're Jewish, look at this. Okay? Let them out on Saturdays. Now, the word did get to America that there were deportations, epidemics, cruelty, and above all, hunger. Who could see through all the baloney? Well, I'll tell you something. American Jews did. It's interesting. The Orthodox were the first. Even though there was a lot of baloney out there, I'll use a nice word, but Harry Fischel was the richest Shomer Shabbos Jew in America, a Lithuanian immigrant. Horatio Alger, he worked himself up in what we would call today the construction and land development business in Manhattan, and he was worth about $10 million, something like that. In those days, when money was money, so he was the one Orthodox Jew that the Reformer led on the American Jewish Committee and all these other committees, token, you know. And he started YU eventually because he gave him $100,000 to start the college. At that time, $100,000 was money. Okay, is that a thing? He's the one who said that they should have kosher food when they have a Jewish organization have a dinner, which was unheard of. Okay, Jacob Schiff said, "What do you want the kosher food for?" Right? President Taft agreed. Listen to this. Used to be Ellis Island. One of the reasons they keep you at Ellis Island, one of the reasons, you look sick, be like a public menace. From Jews, rabbis especially, make the trip on the boat. They don't eat the food. They're not kosher enough. Or they spend the whole time in the steerage. They come off the boat, what do they look like? What did the medical officers say in Ellis Island? They go back. The Reformed Jews said, well, that's the way it goes. Harry Fischel went to William Howard Taft, President of the United States. He said, they didn't eat on the boat. Let me open up a kosher kitchen on Ellis Island and let these guys, like the book of Daniel, give them 2 weeks to get back to normal, then give them an exam. And Taft said, I will do that. Matter of fact, you shouldn't have to pay for it. The federal government will pay for it. Okay? So, as my father always used to say, Mi Kam Yisrael, Goy Echad Baaretz. Now, Therefore, they're great friends, Jewish people, especially in the First World War, as we shall perhaps see. The Orthodox set up something called the Central Relief right away at the beginning of the war. And basically it's like this. Everybody, they send to all the shuls, send a check to Harry Fischel at this place, New York, and his name on it, and I'm going to see to it that the money gets over there. And they trusted him. And, of course, some people say, I guess, sure, you get all the checks right to you. So you had the IRS come in. I wish we could say that of all the Jewish organizations today. He invited the IRS to come in December of 1914 and make audit. And the IRS said, I guess, I wish the Catholic, all the other charities would run as well as this was. Okay? Because there was no overhead, it was all honest, and all the money came in, went to the right place. And they set up the Central Relief. The Orthodox knew how to raise money. They didn't raise a lot of money, but they knew how to raise money from their own. You don't give speeches. You get Yossel Rosenblatt. They give a concert. Show me Yisrael, Shmar Sheis Yisrael. V'yal Yoiva Kol Yisrael. And out come the nickels and dimes, right? Because that's the language of our grandparents, okay? But the Orthodox didn't have a lot of money. It's really, literally with nickel and dime. They used to see people gave nickels. They also gave more money. I'm just saying that much. Listen, for a poor lady working real hard, a nickel was something, and it's a very honorable thing. And they can only raise $2.5 million during the war. To raise serious money, you need Klal Yisrael. You need all the Jews to get on board. The Reform, the Conservative, the Socialist, the Communist, everybody. Not the Communists, but everybody else. And so look, they got together in what I call American Jewry's finest hour. There's Jacob Schiff, there's Rabbi Teitelbaum, there's, Rabbi Berlin from the Mizrahi. All the different groups were represented. The Socialists, the labor unions, the ganze business, to form what they called the Joint Distribution Committee. They said the Orthodox know how to raise money from the Orthodox. The Socialists know how to raise money from the left-wing Jews. The Reform know how to raise money from the richy riches. Each one will raise money from their own, but they'll have a joint distribution committee, decentralized, and all this sort of thing. And the slogan was, we have a Belgium of our own. Because at that time, Herbert Hoover was becoming famous for feeding starving Belgium. Because the Belgians, between the British and the French on one side and the Germans on the other side, the population starved. And Herbert Hoover on his own just set up a one-man operation and fed the whole country. It made him famous. Here, you see the way Belgium, they put out all these signs. Let's go to the next one. Everyone should participate. Look what it says. You buy a ticket for a nickel or $1. I fed and clothed one child a day in Eastern Europe. Well, you give too. And the first check for $500 from Teddy Roosevelt. It's true. It's in the New York Times. Okay, it's in the New York Times. So instead of raising $2.5 million, they raised $25 million, which was money once upon a time. But can it stave off the disaster that we saw of gargantuan proportions? I leave you on that note tonight. Good night.